Happy Halloween! So today I'm going to be talking about Gothic horror and the monsters therein because I think they're some of the most fascinating elements of Gothic literature and Gothic horror. Now, I say Gothic literature because I will also be talking about Gothic literature that doesn't have any overt supernatural elements but does still have its big fears and big grim monsters, kind of, in a way. I am quite the fan of this genre. Actually, my collection isn't huge, but for me, that's a pretty good collection. But yeah, so I quite love this genre. It's one of my favorites, and I've enjoyed reading pretty much all of these books. My favorite has probably been Frankenstein, out of Frankenstein, Dracula. I quite love it, or anything Poe has ever written, really. I am going to be talking about the monsters in the genre and the fears of the time that they were inspired by. One book that I really loved that I read for Halloween last year was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I think that it's an absolutely wonderful exploration of what could happen if science went too far. And I think it's fascinating that Frankenstein is often considered one of the first science fiction novels, as well as being Gothic literature and also kind of a romantic novel. Anyways, it's interesting that a lot of science fiction has very similar ideas of a fear of the future. While there is utopian science fiction, the dystopian genre is pretty iconic and popular, and there's often this fear of the future in it. And I see that in early science fiction as well as Frankenstein, which is early science fiction. So this idea of humanity going too far is pretty popular in science fiction and is popular in Frankenstein, or it's a big idea in Frankenstein. What would it be like if humanity could bring life, something that it's never been able to do? Well, in Victor Frankenstein's case, he creates a being that would be seen as by the outer world as a monster. The monster who never sees any kindness in the course of his becoming intelligent. The monster who never sees any kindness from people and is therefore driven to hate humanity and to destroy all the things that Victor loves. Now, in a lot of ways, it seems that the monster could represent this idea of humanity creating something that destroys it, or humanity going too far and creating something that destroys it, just like the monster destroys everything that Victor loves, basically. Which makes sense. And humanity has created things that could destroy it, that could backfire, despite it being a great technological advance. It could destroy us, and that is something that has actually come to be, right? Of course, it hasn't destroyed us yet, but there's the fear there. There's a fear in that. Actually, Frankenstein is one of the earlier Gothic horror novels, as well as early science fiction, and also a great romantic novel, being written after Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, as well as Lord Byron, all had a challenge to see who could write the best ghost story. Well, it seems that Mary succeeded, although Percy and Byron were also great iconic writers as well. Byron was a very fascinating person. He was kind of a bit of a seducer, and he drank out of a human skull that he found in his yard, which is just fascinating. And Mary Shelley, actually, another morbid fact, Mary Shelley actually kept the calcified heart of Percy Shelley's after he was deceased. And I think she wore it. I'm not sure if she wore it or not. I think she wore it, which is just fascinating. Frankenstein was largely inspired by the myth of Prometheus, and also the rise of Galvanism and the idea that corpses could be reanimated. See, this idea that corpses could be reanimated to us is fiction, but to them in the early 1800s, it was actually seen as something that may soon be possible. So it's this idea of humanity being able to do this, and should humanity even be able to do this? And this would have been on a lot of readers' minds, and it probably would have been a fear of a lot of people, like, should we do this? Is this something that we should do? I think that Frankenstein is largely inspired by those fears of technology at the time, and can also still work with a lot of fears we have now. Humanity has created things that could, like the monster, destroy everything we love, but could we do something that actually succeeds in doing that in the future? Because nothing has technically yet, but it's pretty scary to think about. But I think that's one of the reasons why Frankenstein has stayed so popular. It's also very well written, and it's a great story, and it's fascinating, so that helps, right? So basically, Frankenstein is a tale of dangerous knowledge and humans having power over human life. The fire, in the Prometheus legend. Frankenstein's monster, like I said, seems to represent this fear of this too much knowledge, or fear of the future and technology and things progressing, and humanity creating something that can destroy it. So, the fear of dangerous knowledge humanity should not know. The monster could also represent a societal outsider, and a lot of these monsters could represent a societal outsider. That is a very, very common trope. So there you go. So let's talk about the vampire novels. Novels like Dracula, Carmilla, and other vampire novels all deal with a creature that is inherently considered a monster. Now, in a lot of these pieces of fiction, the creature or the person will become the looming monster of the novel. They will not start out as it, or they won't have always been. But the vampire is an exception to that. They are inherently considered monsters typically, unless someone is turned into a vampire. And even then, they are considered as just being monsters now because of what they are, right? The vampire is often interpreted as a metaphor for powerful people, or as a monster created from the fear of outsiders, which makes a lot of sense. Vampires have also been interpreted as being the fear of sexuality in general, and especially that Carmilla and Dracula were both written during the Victorian era, which was an age of just being really repressed, at least on the surface, maybe not beneath the surface. Of course, this is very, very obvious in the novel Carmilla, because Carmilla basically overtly confesses her love to the main character of the novel, who is a lady, or actually a girl. But that, you think that, like, the picture of Dorian Gray is as overt as something like that could get at the time, but really that's not true. Carmilla, it's just overt, and I think that's really interesting because it is a very rare thing to actually come across in a fairly popular novel of the time, right? Now, Dracula may actually not seem overtly sexual to modern readers, but to a Victorian audience it probably would have. It's very, like, up close, and there's a lot of biting and fluid exchanging. Yeah, think about it. If you think about it like that, it gets that way. It's not just Dracula or Camilla that brought this like sexual overtone to the idea of a vampire, but also even in earlier stories like The Vampire by John Polidori tells of a vampire who preys on young women. This vampire called Lord Ruthven was actually inspired by Lord Byron, a well-known seducer of young women and some men. The vampire can also be viewed as a fear of the outsider. Dracula is this Eastern European guy coming to take over England. He's all evil and malicious, and he's very overdramatic, right? In the essay, Dracula and Xenophobia, it is written that Dracula's thirst for blood of English people solidifies him as a symbol for foreign races that will erase the English, sucking blood from England. The fear of outsiders was common during the era in which this novel was written, so the Victorian era. So the novel seems to be playing on this fear. They were going around colonizing all these places, so what if there was also kind of this fear of, like, this reverse colonization. What if they got colonized? What if all these people came in, and blah, 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 blah. And, you get stuff like this today as well. But it's very fascinating. It was a common fear at the time, especially with Britain being so powerful and all. It felt like, what if we fall? What if something happens, Also, you see this in science fiction novels like The War of the Worlds, which is very much plays on the fear of outsiders. Also, there's stuff possibly in Bram Stoker's own life that inspired some of the fears that came into Dracula, and I will link the videos that actually talk about that, so if you want to know more about Stoker and some of the fears also that inspired Dracula. Okay, so an extremely popular Gothic trope is the idea of a person or a creature becoming a monster, rather than inherently being one. Sometimes it's a way the society treats them, like in Frankenstein or The Phantom of the Opera. So, in The Phantom of the Opera, I don't have a copy of this book. I do have Frankenstein and Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde all in this book, but I don't sadly have a copy of Phantom. In The Phantom of the Opera, it seems to represent a pretty simple idea, a monster created by society's treatment. Eric may never have become the catacomb coffin-dwelling, Eric may never have become the coffin-sleeping, catacomb-dwelling, murderous, kidnapping monster that he became if he had been shown a little bit of compassion, which is kind of why the ending is the way it is in the novel, and I don't really want to spoil it, but I guess everyone's probably seen the musical, and it's quite similar. It's basically Christine shows him some compassion, and he lets her go, because it's the first time in his life he's ever been shown any compassion. So despite being born with a deformity, it did not always have to be inevitable that Eric would become a monster. It was because of his consistently being shown no compassion. This mirrors kind of what happened in Frankenstein, this consistent idea of someone being shown no compassion, so therefore turning into a monster. It's like hurt people. And so that's a really fascinating thing. So maybe you could interpret, I'd say the moral in Phantom is pretty obvious, which is like maybe not treat people like they're monsters because they're different than us, like that, or they look deformed or different, you know. Sometimes the monster is created or is inspired by an obsession with staying young, or even more, the corruption from another person, like in the Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as some of those vampire stories. Now, the Picture of Dorian Gray in a lot of ways feels like a vampire story. This beautiful man stays young and basically just does all this messed up stuff for like 20 years, and then I don't want to spoil the rest, so. See, this obsession with superficiality in youth seems to be one of the main topics of the book, which is actually fascinating. If you know anything about Oscar Wilde, he was actually very interested in beauty, and so this would have been a topic that he knew about. He was an aesthete, so he was into the whole idea of art for art's sake, and the idea of art just basically being around art, making one's life better, basically, if that makes sense. And so he actually had some really interesting takes on this, because so if Oscar was into such beautiful things, then how is it that, but he could also he could also portray the downfall of someone who was so into beautiful things, which is, it's weird. It's an odd mirror of his life, which is really fascinating. The actual portrait of Dorian Gray is the biggest symbol in the novel, representing the deterioration of Dorian's soul, despite his eternal beauty. It's about the deterioration of the soul while the face stays beautiful. I guess Dorian wouldn't really be considered a proper monster, but I do believe that this book is important enough in the genre that it needs to be brought up. Yeah, I would say that the Picture of Dorian Gray is kind of important enough in the genre that it should definitely be brought up. And as far as monsters go, Dorian definitely becomes one, and it is all from the corruption of an outsider, which was another fear, which again is a very vampiric kind of trope, this corruption from an outsider telling you all these things, which is what happens to Dorian, similar to getting bit by a vampire, staying young, and acting like a complete idiot and doing all these horrible things. So I think in The Error in which this was written, a lot of people were afraid of there just being the snap and now they're a bad person and now they're disgraced, because that was so easy back then to be disgraced. You could do like barely anything wrong, you know. Sometimes, and similarly, let's move on to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Sometimes it's the dark side of a person that takes over, like in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde can be seen as an allegory, and also I don't know if I should do spoilers for this particular story, because everyone knows. So if you have never read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you don't know the plot twist, I guess skip like a minute forward or 2 minutes forward. Okay, so everyone knows that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person inherently, basically, and they're two sides of him. Now, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde can kind of be seen as an allegory for any sort of vice, for example, drug use or alcoholism, right? Often a person will act one way and completely another on drugs or when they're sober. Like someone could be I've seen this happen to people. They act so normal, but then they go and do drugs, or they're drinking a lot of alcohol or any sort of bad thing or anything, and they will become just kind of completely different person sometimes. And that's kind of what Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's the fear that's supposed to represent, the fear of this vice taking over you. Again, that's a very common fear at the time, right? It's kind of all about repression, because if you let yourself slip once, then you're going to turn into this monster, right? It's really interesting to think about. In an age as repressed as the Victorian era, the idea of a vice taking over someone completely is probably a common fear, because, like, in the end, Jekyll is overtaken by Hyde, and there's nothing he can do about it. And so the story by Robert Louis Stevenson kind of represents that. It should also be noted that some Gothic monsters are actually quite sympathetic. I mean, I would say Eric the Phantom is sympathetic, although he is a freaking psychopath. Not very sympathetic, just to the point where he should not have been treated so badly, right? But the most sympathetic of Gothic monsters, also, I don't want to consider him a monster, is Quasimodo. He is not the villain, but the hero in the story. Still, like I said, Quasimodo reminds me a lot of Eric the Phantom, in that he's seen as a monster by most of society and he is ridiculed for it. Quasimodo seems to be a critique of the treatment of people who are deemed as freaks, basically. He's quite humanized. Phantom is actually the opposite, as he becomes a villain from how he's treated, while Quasimodo is the hero of the story despite how he is treated, so it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. Claude Frollo could actually be seen as the monster of the story. Take note that he's a priest. That brings up a really interesting discussion. Yeah, it was kind of difficult in Hugo's time to. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was written by Victor Hugo. That's the novel I'm talking about. It was kind of difficult at the time to criticize religion very easily. You could get in trouble for it more easily, or criticize the religious structure, at least, right? So it's not necessarily always with the religion, but with the people within it, with structure, or the way that it's being carried out, etc., you know. Nuance, blah, blah, blah. Take note, the fact that he's a priest and brings up an interesting discussion. Frollo also pretty obviously represents that fear of sexuality that I brought up earlier, especially as he's a priest, and, you know, priests could not have any partners at the time or anything like that. So I see him as being a sort of stand-in for the corruption within religion and religious places. He feels a sort of strange guilt for being a trap and also the consequences thereof. He feels a strange sort of guilt for being attracted to Esmeralda, therefore he blames it on demons and her. He sees it as her fault, basically. It's kind of a common trope, but a sad one, of women being blamed for the other person's desire of them, which is pretty messed up. It says a lot about how people sometimes viewed women at the time. Sometimes the monster is a possibly real ghost of a dead lover, like in Wuthering Heights. Okay, I had to bring up Wuthering Heights, okay? We're talking about Gothic books. Wuthering Heights is a unique example of Gothic literature in that we don't actually know if supernatural elements are meant to be real. I wouldn't say the ghost is the real monster, although it is the only sort of supernatural element in it. The only truly real monster created in Wuthering Heights is Heathcliff, who is a classic example of the Byronic hero. Heathcliff's cruelness is created through an all-consuming love for Catherine Heathcliff, and it is mutual. She's also madly in love with him, basically. Although it's a very toxic relationship, extremely toxic. Don't idolize it or anything. Spoiler alert for Wuthering Heights. Spoiler alert, okay? I'll do a timestamp. Skip a little bit ahead. You don't want to get spoiled for this book because everyone should read it at least once, okay? Catherine dies, and possibly literally and metaphorically haunts Heathcliff, therefore turning him into the monster. He becomes the kind of all-consuming of the novel, you know. Wuthering Heights seems to be a warning of the sort of all-consuming emotion and love which can create more real-life, down-to-earth monsters. There was also a bit of critique of social class in there. So, yeah, Heathcliff is like a real-life sort of monster. There's no supernatural elements really except for the ghost in Wuthering Heights, but it is pretty effective nonetheless. And yeah, of course, like again, this was written, I think, in the Victorian era, so age of repression. Too much emotion can lead to a bad thing. And it is true, though. I mean, I would say there are things, if you have too much emotion, it can lead to a bad thing, but at the same time, also says a lot about when it was written, right? So, another novel I'm going to talk about is Jane Eyre, and actually in Jane Eyre, there are no real supernatural elements, but there are comparisons to supernatural elements in the book, and it is a Gothic novel. An alive lover locked up in the attic in Jane Eyre, who is seen as the monster in the novel, although it is debated whether she really is. The woman is actually Rochester's wife, Jane Eyre's love interest. She went mad and was locked in the attic she went mad for the same things that Rochester had gotten away with and is acting just normal. So why is that? That's strange, isn't it? Throughout the novel, she is kind of the main antagonist and gets into some strange antics, to say the least. She's even compared to a vampire at one point. Bertha's madness and confinement, rather than any sort of help or treatment, represents something common at the time that it was written. The fear of women, their lives, their emotions, actually getting them help. Jane and Bertha are quite similar, actually. So if you ever watch the Crash Course videos or Crash Course Literature, which is I like to watch them after I read a novel and if I want to further understand the novel or any other takes on the novel. So in the Crash Course episode discussing Jane Eyre, John Green, the host, brings, and also a writer himself, brings up the idea that Bertha is a sort of dark mirror to Jane. I think that this is a really good idea and way of analyzing the two characters. Bertha is the unrestrained woman inside of Jane that Jane has to kill off to be socially acceptable enough to marry Mr. Rochester. Every time Jane is upset, this monstrous side Bertha acts out. Despite Jane Eyre not actually having any true supernatural elements, the monster in it reveals a lot about the society in which it was written. In the end, I think that a lot of these villains, monsters, and even heroes reveal a lot about the society that they were written in, and also our own society still. I see 19th century Gothic era novels as being similar to the 21st century and the 20th century dystopian science fiction novels that similarly commentate on the society in which they were written in. Those are the two most interesting genres to me to pick apart, and I love picking apart books because I am such a history nerd. I love learning the context, and I think that an interest in books, or at least a lot of classic books, starts with an interest in history, because I think if you're not interested in history, it's going to be hard to get interested in some of these novels. Anyways, happy Halloween, be safe, don't, get bitten by a vampire or anything, have fun. Hope you enjoyed.